Okay, this little video is going to focus on the endocrine system. It's one of the animal organ systems that we did not cover a few months ago when we were covering animal organ systems, but it's a really important one, and it deals with a really important concept that you may see referred to in an AP Bio exam or test as cell signaling. If you see the phrase cell signaling, one of the first things that should come to your mind is the endocrine system. The nervous system would be another one, and we'll try to tie it in with some other systems as well. But the endocrine system is the system in your body that is made up of your glands. These things that we've often heard of, your pituitary gland, your adrenal glands, your thymus gland, things like that. And what they do is they secrete chemicals, chemical messengers called hormones. So one part of your body is secreting these hormones in order to tell another part of your body it's time to do something, and to do it, to have an effect on another part of your body. Okay, so hormones are needed because they carry messages from one body part to another. And this is more of a coordination of big processes, for example, growth, or big processes like, maintaining homeostasis with regard to some aspect. For example, homeostatic control, things like keeping your glucose level appropriate in your bloodstream, your calcium levels, and other things. If your glucose level is not maintained, you may have a disease that you might know of as diabetes. So keeping these kinds of levels in your body are things that are controlled by hormones in your endocrine system. But there's bigger scale things that are more long-lasting permanent effects, like growth, maturity, development, things like that, that are also coordinated and regulated by your hormones. So a lot of different aspects to this organ system. Now, this slide is a really nice one in that it juxtaposes these two systems of communication. Okay? Your nervous system, which we see over here on the left side of the screen, symbolized by the neuron. If you'll remember way back when, we talked about the neuron being made up of dendrites and the cell body and the axon and then the little ends of the axon. And then there's this space called a synapse, and then beyond the synapse would be some other cell that perhaps the nerve was trying to stimulate. That's a way to communicate. You're communicating a signal from your brain to some body part, or from some body part to your brain. Over here we see the endocrine system symbolized by showing of all the different glands that might be in a human. This is another way for the body to communicate with itself. But in this case, we're talking about distances of communication much greater than from one cell, this cell to cell to cell, from one cell to another. In this case, you would have some chemical being secreted maybe by this pituitary gland, and perhaps it's sending a signal to this thymus gland that needs to secrete something from the thyroid, rather, to another part of the body so that the body will do something it needs to do. So this is cell to cell through electrical signals. This is from one body part by secreting chemicals into the bloodstream to another body part. So endocrine system versus nervous system, a system of glands, ductless glands, meaning they aren't connected to other body organs with little tubes, and they don't stream their contents directly into some other body organ, but rather into the blood, and then the blood will carry these hormones where they need to go, and they get to some target tissue, and that target tissue has certain specific receptors that are going to receive these chemicals called hormones. And if we don't have the receptor, I don't care if you secrete a hormone all day long, it will have no effect, because if the cell where it's supposed to go, maybe it's supposed to go to this adrenal gland on top of the kidney, it will have no effect if the adrenal glands don't have the receptor to receive the stimulus they're supposed to get. Generally speaking, this is a slow, long-lasting response, as opposed to the nervous system that's going to be, have these electrical signals that move very quickly, and it's a much quicker response, but it's not long-term. It's a short-lasting, immediate response to a stimulus. This is a nice slide here, because this one is emphasizing once again the end of the axon and these chemical neurotransmitters. So here's where we are converting the electrical signal in the neuron to a chemical signal to get it across into a particular target cell. You got to have receptors, as we see here, to get that information to a target cell. So neurotransmitters, remember that. And they are being sent to receptor proteins on a target cell, and it's a very quick response to a stimulus. The other side is showing a hormone being produced in an endocrine gland, but being placed in the bloodstream and carried very far to get to some target cell where, again, there would be receptor proteins that need to receive that hormone in order for it to have a response. Okay? And if the receptors and the chemicals that are supposed to fit them don't fit, then it doesn't work. Okay? Now, there are two major classes of hormones you need to talk about. One is proteins and one is lipids. Okay, so one class of hormones made of protein and one class of hormones is made of lipids. Okay, please remember from way back at the beginning of the year, proteins are those things that are made up of amino acids. We've got several different types, and I'm going to click them up here, but really I don't think it's terribly important that you know these different subcategories of protein-based hormones. Just understand that some hormones are made out of protein. If I would maybe take this time as a time to review this term called glycoprotein. Okay, if you'll remember, we talked about proteins that have a carbohydrate stuck to them. That's what the glyco means. That carbohydrate is an oligosaccharide very often, not as big as a polysaccharide, but bigger than a monosaccharide. You might want to remember that term just because it pops up in several places. But all of these different proteins, some of them are very famous. Insulin is a protein hormone. It is made out of amino acids made out of protein. FSH and LH also epinephrine, which is another word for adrenaline. All these are made out of amino acids, or many amino acids, to make up a protein. The other type of hormone is lipid-based, and it's not, if you'll remember, lipids are fats and oils and waxes, and one other group called steroids. Steroids are the lipids that do create some of their other set of hormones. If you'll remember, way back when we talked about lipids, we said that the steroids were all based on this particular chemical form. This is cholesterol. It is made out of 4 rings of carbon, okay, with different stuff dangling off of those rings. Any steroid hormone, the estrogens, the testosterones, they are all fundamentally cholesterol, this 4 carbon ring structure. It's just that there's different stuff dangling off of it, different functional groups that make the different steroid hormones different from each other. Okay, so please keep those images in mind of proteins versus lipid-based or steroid hormones. Now, how these hormones act on target cells is different based on if they are lipids or if they are proteins. Okay, if it is a lipid hormone, remember that lipids are non-polar. They are hydrophobic. Water doesn't like them, quote unquote. They don't like water. They don't mingle with water well. They separate from water. That said, there is something that they can do because they aren't polar, and they don't get hung up with the polar aspects of a cell membrane. They can actually diffuse across a cell membrane and go right into a cell. Okay? And so these lipid-based hormones, the bottom line to this that you need to remember is that they have effects on cells because of the things they do when they enter a cell. And usually this is having to do with making a gene at the genetic level, at the DNA level, get activated or not. Protein-based hormones are different. Most proteins are polar, generally speaking. They can't cross a cell membrane. If you'll remember, hydrophilic things get hung up with those phosphate heads in a cell membrane. And so proteins would do that, and they cannot get into the cell. And so they have to, since they can't get diffuse across the cell membrane, they have to do their activity by simply binding to a receptor on the surface of the cell membrane, and then using that receptor to create an effect on the inside of the cell. So bottom line for this slide, lipids create their effects by entering directly into the cell, diffusing into it, squidging between the phospholipids because they're nonpolar. Protein hormones get hung up on the outside of the cell. They can't cross it, but they can engage with their receptor proteins and cause an effect that way. Okay, so this slide is showing us the actions of lipid or steroid hormones. So this thing labeled S out here might be estrogen or testosterone, one of those things that looks like cholesterol but is just slightly different. Okay, and we need to set up your diagram here so you understand what you're seeing. So that is the blood that is initially carrying the hormone from its source, wherever it was created, from its endocrine gland. And this over on the left side of the screen represents the target cell. This blue part with the white interior represents the plasma membrane. Remember, those are phospholipids, and the polar heads are on the outside, the nonpolar tails are on the inside. The cytoplasm is here, and the nucleus is represented by this purple area with the green nuclear membrane. Now, the first thing that happens is that this steroid hormone, being a lipid and nonpolar, will be freed across the membrane as long as its diffusion gradient will carry it across. So that happens. Now, once this steroid is in the cell, it will bind to a protein receptor inside the cell, and then that will allow it to journey into the nucleus. Why do we want to get it in the nucleus? Well, as I mentioned, these things often act to activate genes. Our goal here in this case is going to be to create a protein, and because this hormone is going to go into the into the nucleus and affect the DNA, we are going to end up causing the DNA to undergo transcription and to create a protein. This is going to happen because when this binds to this receptor, that receptor is going to become a transcription factor. I don't know if you remember, but when we were doing transcriptions, RNA polymerase has to be able to find the promoter sequence to know where to begin transcribing. It needs to be told where the ta-ta box is. Transcription factors are the things that hook on to the appropriate promoter, the appropriate ta-ta box, and tell the RNA polymerase, hey, over here, stupid, this is where you need to start transcribing this particular gene. We need it now. And so once that happens, it's the steroid has become essentially a transcription factor. Then mRNA is allowed to be created. Once mRNA is created, it's read by the ribosome and translated into a protein. Okay? And maybe this protein is going to go out of the cell and do something. For example, maybe this protein is a growth factor. If we hadn't received the steroid hormone into the cell, this gene would not have been turned on, this growth factor would not have been made, it couldn't have created the hair, the bone, the muscle, whatever it is that this particular growth factor is supposed to create would not have been created if this steroid had not turned the gene on. So that's one way that hormones can work. They can activate the DNA so that protein synthesis ultimately will occur. Now, I'm going to stop this here so that I can upload these in small chunks instead of one huge chunk, and we will pick up at this point with the next section on protein hormones. Thanks.